Well, we've started 2025, and I think we will kind of continue where we left off last year. And I know that I did a couple of videos about whirlybirds, and there seems to be a hell of a lot of interest in whirlybirds and ventilation just in general.
So the air can be pulled through, and that cool air can come right through the roof and clear out that hot air. But when you've got a small cavity space, it's really not effective at all.
So what we're going to do to start the year off is just to look at ventilation, how important it is, and why ventilation has such a huge impact on our lives. Now, there's a lot to talk about with ventilation, and because of this, there's going to be more than one video about ventilation. So to start off, we should look at the basics of ventilation and ask the question, what is ventilation? And I think ventilation can be boiled down to something very simple, and it's all about moving air around. So that's what ventilation is to move air around. But because it's so simple, doesn't mean that it's not important, because if it wasn't for the ability to move air around, that is ventilation, the weather that we experience would not happen. Why, would you ask? Well, those of us who stick around long enough to the end of news will know that weather people talk about movement of air from high pressure to low pressure. And this movement of air from high pressure to low pressure is actually what gives us the weather. So now that we know that this movement of air is so important to our weather pattern, we can bring this a bit closer to home, and we should ask us the question, where does ventilation come into play when we consider our homes and ourselves? Well, one thing to look at is that we are now in a fairly hot, we are in the summer now in Sydney, Australia, and we sweat. I sweat a lot, and if it wasn't for ventilation, I would have a very uncomfortable life, because the reason we sweat is to bring moisture up on our skin, and when we move our bodies or when air flows across our skin, what happens is that the air causes liquid to turn into vapor. And to turn liquid into vapor, we need energy. So now what happens is that the body cools because heat energy is given to the water molecules to turn it into vapor molecules. And then because you've given heat away, you're left with a colder surface. And that's why your body cools when sweat evaporates. So now it's the same thing with your home, the living area and your roof area. Now, in the old days, before air conditioning, we were still able to survive in the very, really hot days, simply because we had the ability to move air around. We could either use a fan and fan ourselves, or we have mechanical fans that actually move the air around. So the best way to keep an area or ourselves cool is to move air in and out. That is ventilation. And that's why ventilation is so important. So the best way to cool a living area is to move air through it. So you should be able to have an opening where you let fresh air in and have some means of actually moving that air through the space that you're living and then out the other side, and you get this continuous airflow. And when you get a continuous airflow, you get evaporation and you get cooling. So you would have evaporation on your skin and you feel cool. But not only that, all the objects in the room will have a little bit of moisture on it, and as the air flows through, those objects actually cool. So it's not only yourself that feels cooler, everything around you also cools down when you get the ventilation. And that's why ventilation is so important. And now to take it one step further, we know that when we sweat and we cool off, our skin actually goes from wet to damp to dry. So not only do we cool, we remove moisture. And that's why ventilation becomes more important, because not only does ventilation cool things down, it actually removes moisture. And the ability of moving air to remove moisture is the most important thing when it comes to the buildings, the houses that we live in. And that's the reason why the National Construction Code has come down really heavily on ventilation, because it knows that there's this thing called the sick building syndrome that's hit countries like New Zealand and Canada. And if we don't do the right thing here in Australia, our temperate areas will also be hit by the sick building syndrome. The leaking building syndrome is another name for it. And this is simply because if we don't remove excessive moisture from our buildings, moisture promotes rot, and moisture also promotes this thing called mold. Now, I see mold all the time because a lot of clients come to us and they say, we've got mold in our ceilings. Do we have a roof leak? And my answer is, maybe you have and maybe you haven't. But because you've got mold, you obviously have a damp issue. And damp issues are caused by lack of ventilation. So it is really, really important to be able to ventilate your homes. The living area needs to be ventilated, and also the areas you don't see, which is the wall cavity and the roof cavity. Those cavities you can't see, and you don't know what's happening behind the ceiling and behind the wall lining. So you've got to have means to ventilate this area so that if the structure gets wet, it doesn't stay wet, and you get sufficient airflow through these cavities to actually dry it out. And that's what the National Construction Code is trying to do, is to have requirements that all our new buildings get sufficient ventilation into the cavities so that we don't have these hidden moist areas that will promote either rot or mold growth. So now, while we are in the middle of summer here in Australia and we're all worried about cooling, it's not actually the summer months that are important when it comes to leaking building syndrome. It's the winter months. It is when things cool down and we have the reverse happening. That's when it gets problematic. So in the next video, we'll look at what happens in the winter months when typically your house cools down and why ventilation is so important in the wall cavity and in the roof cavity.